Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome members of the HPC's governing board, HPC staff, and members of the public to this virtual public board meeting of the Massachusetts Health Policy Commission. It's hard to believe, but this is actually our 6th virtual public meeting the HPC has conducted since the beginning of the pandemic 6 months ago. Thank you, commissioners, for your time and engagement with the HPC's work throughout this crisis. For members of the public and market stakeholders who are watching this meeting on our live YouTube channel, thank you for your ongoing engagement as well. You can find the slide presentation that we will review this afternoon available on our website now. And I believe there should be a link within our video description on the YouTube account to the slides as well. Additionally, as always, we encourage you to follow us on Twitter at mass_HPC for all of the latest news on the HPC. We are hoping to stay connected with you, and we are always putting out new and interesting research papers, data points, policy briefs, and that's a great way to stay connected with us. Before I introduce today's agenda, I'm going to quickly announce the commissioners that are here in this live Zoom today, and then I'm going to turn it over to our esteemed board chair, Stuart Altman, for a few remarks. So in addition to Chair Altman, we're joined here today by Commissioners Barbara Blakeney, Martin Cohen, Tim Foley, Cassandra Roeder, Lauren Peters, I already said Tim Foley, Rick Lord, David Cutler, I saw Chris Kreider, and Don Berwick as well, and Ron Mastrogiovanni. So I think we have a full contingent of our HPC commissioners here today. Colleen, did I forget anyone as I was doing that roll call?
No, you did great.
Thanks. And now I'm going to turn it over to Stuart for a few opening remarks.
I believe Stuart's muted.
Well, Stuart, you're on mute.
I'm unmuted now, yes. The world muted me, so I thought the world was going to unmute me, but all right. Okay, so again, let me second David Seltz's welcome. We look forward to a good, exciting meeting. There's some really interesting information that the staff has put together. But before we get going, we need to approve the minutes for the July 22nd virtual meeting. So I will take any, first of all, whether there is a motion to review the minutes.
So moved.
If those, any comments or questions or changes in the minutes? If not, I'm going to ask our esteemed Deputy Executive Director, Colleen Hestemeyer, to read off the names. We need to sort of take a voice vote about the minutes. So Colleen?
Yes, if everyone could just unmute yourselves, please. I'll start with you, Chair Altman.
Support the minutes.
Vice Chair Cohen.
Aye.
Commissioner Berwick.
Aye.
Commissioner Blakeney.
Aye.
Commissioner Cutler.
Aye.
Commissioner Foley.
Aye.
Commissioner Kreider.
Yes.
Commissioner Lord.
Aye.
Commissioner Mastrogiovanni.
Yes.
Undersecretary Peters.
Aye.
And Commissioner Roeder.
Aye.
Well,
Back
that's
to you,
correct.
Mr. Chairman.
All right, so it's unanimous and the minutes have been approved. I'm now going to turn the meeting back to our esteemed Executive Director, David Seltz, to fill us in on what's been going on, particularly our activities with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we're moving forward with respect to our cost trends hearings and any other issues that they would like to bring up. David?
Great. Thank you, Chair Altman. We do have a pretty full agenda today, so I will keep my preview of the agenda pretty brief, but we do have a lot of weighty topics for presentation and discussion, beginning with an update on the drug pricing review process, which is a relatively new responsibility of HPCs that was authorized in last year's budget. We'll then hear a research presentation on an upcoming policy brief that we've prepared on end-of-life care for Medicare members in Massachusetts, with a particular focus on racial disparities, consistent with our current emphasis on health equity topics. And finally, we're going to return to conversations and ongoing discussion about the impact of COVID-19 on the healthcare system with a few new data slides from David Auerbach, before turning it over to Deputy Commissioner of the Division of Insurance, Kevin Began, who will be joining us during the second hour for an update on payer trends in Massachusetts. So looking forward to having Kevin with us for that. But before we dive into all of that, I did want to give a brief executive director's report. So first, we didn't prepare a slide on this, so let's just keep it on the previous slide for just a moment. But I did want to provide a brief update on the HPC's continued role in assisting and supporting the state's COVID-19 response, and in particular, the command center led by Secretary Sutters. As I've mentioned at previous meetings, we've been participating in cross-agency initiatives and activities to support the state's response and planning. And those activities have continued even during this more relatively stable time period of the COVID epidemic in this state. One of the important activities that we've taken on in partnership with the Department of Public Health is the daily quality control and analysis of hospital bed occupancy for every hospital in the state. This is done on a daily basis. Every hospital reports daily to the state, and our team, along with DPH, works to ensure the completeness of that data and analyzes and prepares graphical outputs of that data, which are then fed to the governor, Secretary Sutters, and to the public through some of the public dashboards that you may have seen. The quality and the reliability of this data is really critical, as it is also being required by the federal government for hospitals to report in, and may inform resource allocations from the federal government in the future. And so keeping a close eye on our health system's capacity to maintain equitable access to high quality care for all patients, COVID or otherwise, and in all communities is a top priority and part of the goal of this daily work and really looking at hospital capacity. We have a small but mighty cross-departmental team that is led by Kara Vidal that's been leading this work on our behalf. And we're just really proud to be able to work with the Department of Public Health, as well as with every hospital in the Commonwealth on this important daily reporting activity. Secondly, we and myself are continuing to assist in any way that we can with planning for a potential fall resurgence of COVID and for flu season, again, with a focus on health system preparedness and capacity. And so this continues to be really an all hands on deck work across state government. And I'm proud that the HPC has been able to be a key contributor and collaborator with our sister agencies and the hospitals in Massachusetts. So I wanted to provide that brief update to the board. Happy to answer any questions about this work, but would expect to update you regularly about our ongoing supportive activities with the state. Seeing no immediate questions, I think we can continue in the executive director's report. And I'm going to turn now to Colleen Elstenmeyer to give an update on our work around health equity and diversity, equity, and inclusion. As this was a major topic at our last board meeting, we presented to you, the board, a framework for adoption of making health equity a core component of our work moving forward. And we were so thrilled by the enthusiastic response by you and by many of our stakeholders coming out of that meeting. But we think it's really important to note that this is not just a statement of our principles and values, but really around informing action. And so wanted to come back today to give you an update on some of those very specific action steps that we are making our health equity and diversity priorities live at the HPC. So with that, I'll turn it over to Colleen to walk through some examples of how we're making this work.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. So yes, since we announced the HPC's new health equity operational framework and principles at the last board meeting, I am excited to report that we've hit the ground running on several equity-focused projects corresponding with each of the HPC's 4 roles, as you see on this slide. We're employing all 4 of our core strategies to center and integrate and advance health equity into all of the HPC's work streams, both internal and external. So in the first category, research and report, we're working closely with our sister agency, the Center for Health Information Analysis, CHIA, to incorporate race and ethnicity data into the all-payer claims database, the APCD, through linking with other data sources such as case mix, including more detailed geographic information or enhanced payer reporting on the front end. This data, as many of you know, has been inconsistent and incomplete for a long time, and our hope is to be able to better understand the demographic differences in health and outcomes once we are able to access these factors. I also wanted to mention under research and report that we have an equity style guide in development to promote best practices for integrating concepts of equity across all HPC written work streams, including ensuring consistent and appropriate terminology that aligns with our health equity framework and commitment. In our role as watchdog, we have enhanced our existing approaches to examining the impacts of market changes on access to care through a health equity lens. So these approaches include, first, building on our prior use of race, ethnicity, and economic data in the Beth Israel Lahey Health Cost and Market Impact Review, the CMIR, to better understand the populations that will be impacted by proposed market changes, including how those populations may have been infected by the COVID pandemic. And secondly, also considering ways in which the pandemic may impact providers that have traditionally served underserved populations and how we can address those impacts proactively to enhance our focus on the populations those providers serve. And in this category, I also just wanted to mention that our Office of Patient Protection is developing an enhanced outreach strategy for consumers seeking assistance with health insurance coverage. So for the partnership role, our role as partner is central, obviously, to advancing all of our health equity work streams, in addition to the Mass Up initiative and investment program, which is really the cornerstone of our policy and program work in health equity. Just a quick update there that we've actually completed all contracts with all Mass Up awardees and look forward to program launch this fall. So in addition to Mass Up, we have 2 new grant programs in development. So these are legislatively directed grant programs. The first of which, and we intend to release application information for this fall. This is a program aiming to bridge the gaps in care for children born substance exposed and provide support to their caregivers. And then the second program focuses on addressing maternal health and more specifically on providing support to women of color who suffer from higher rates of pregnancy-related complications than white women. And so Massachusetts has a low overall rate of maternal mortality relative to other states, but significant inequities are present, varying by race and ethnicity. So we hope to be able to address those disparities in care with this grant opportunity. So more to come on that. Also, just want to mention that we're integrating equity-focused measures into our ACO certification criteria design, as well as supporting an equity working group of Mass Challenge Health Tech, who we partner with on digital health policy. And then finally, I just want to shout out our other state agency partners who are also centering this work. We rarely work alone, and most of the projects listed here are multi-stakeholder projects. So we're looking forward to working with all of our fellow state agencies, as well as the private sector, to create the most impact across the Commonwealth. And then finally, just on the convener role, especially important to ensuring diverse perspectives are heard On the external side, we're looking forward to more in-depth conversations about health equity and anti-racism with our stakeholders through the Advisory Council and at the upcoming cost trends hearing, which Director Seltz will provide you an update on very shortly. And then on the internal side, as I announced at the July board meeting, we have hired a consultant for diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting and training services to support the HPC internally on our DEI initiatives. And that's it on this slide. So before I turn it back over to David, I really don't want to leave the impression that this is just me or HPC management alone doing this work. I'm just the messenger. Our entire staff is committed to this agenda and our principles, and we're working together to advance equity in our work and in our agency. And these efforts are only the beginning. We're going to continue to move the needle on issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and I will provide you updates at upcoming board meetings on this work as we move forward. Back to you, David.
Well, first, just want to pause to see if there are any questions or comments on that important work.
Just a word of thanks, David. This is an amazing amount of activity, and Colleen, thank you for your leadership. But it's extraordinary.
Thank you. Thank you for your support, all of you commissioners. So the next slide in the executive director's report is just, I will not walk through all of this, but we have a lot of upcoming publications that we want to make sure that the public and our stakeholders are aware of, all coming out. So we've been, I think, a reflection of how much work has been going on, even during this time period, and a testament to HPC staff who've really been able to embrace the virtual working environment and did not miss a beat in terms of all of the publications and work that have been part of our agenda for this year. I will only mention two things out of all of the ones here, which is the CHART playbook and the CHART phase 2 evaluation report. This month, September, is actually the 5-year anniversary of when CHART phase 2 began its awardee programs. As you all may remember, for those of the commissioners who were a part of this, CHART phase 2 was really our largest and most impactful grant program to date in terms of the amount of money that we distributed, the length of the programs, and the ambition with which we and hospitals work together to address the needs of very complex patients. And so while the CHART phase 2 awardees completed their work a while ago, we have been hard at work at an evaluation report that will document both kind of the process by which CHART phase 2 played out and the impacts that we can document from that. So will be, I think, a really important summary of this really impactful investment program, and look forward to being able to use the learnings from that to help inform our policy work moving forward. In addition, we also have this CHART playbook, and the playbook has been really one of our top priorities in kind of the learning and dissemination work. And the playbook is really intended to try to capture the knowledge, expertise, and insights from our awardees and then share them back in a way that would support other hospitals or healthcare providers from taking on these types of initiatives themselves. So really taking the best practices, the best learnings from the CHART program and creating an actionable playbook for others to be able to take up, pick up, and implement similar programs within their own organizations. So with the release of these two seminal pieces of CHART publications, we are dubbing this month CHART-tember in honor of this program, and look forward to being able to present the findings at future meetings with you. On the next slide, we can move on. Thrilled actually to give an update on the upcoming healthcare cost trends hearing. So as has been mentioned at the previous meetings, this year is going to be a little bit different, more than a little bit different. First, we altered some of the reporting timelines for payers to report to the state around healthcare spending. So this will be the first year that we will not have information about the state's performance against the benchmark in the fall. That report will be released in early 2021. So nonetheless, while this hearing will not focus on our performance against the benchmark, we did still think it was an opportunity with these dates saved and in this moment to have an opportunity to convene market stakeholders, you commissioners, experts and others together for a much more focused and streamlined event. So what we're proposing here is one half day for the entire event. So very different than the 2 full days, which has been our practice for 8 years. And really to focus our time in this event on assessing the impact of COVID-19 on the healthcare system and continuing this policy priority around advancing equity. So we've dubbed this assessing impact, advancing equity. How we envision the hearing is not too dissimilar from how we've held these hearings before. We hope to have an expert speaker and then be able to engage in a dialogue with a select number of panelists representing some of our most important organizations here in Massachusetts to really engage in a conversation with you, the Board of Commissioners, on the COVID impact and where we go next and what the priorities should be. So a lot of details still get to be finalized in terms of the speaker and the panelists. We know that time is running short, and so we're working very hard to finalize all of those really important details. But wanted to give this update on what we're currently thinking for this fall special event on healthcare and specifically on COVID-19.
Hey, David, is going back to the last slide and linking it into the cost trends hearings. I recently read where the CMS has come out with a very favorable report on the ACO program in terms of more organizations joining, and actually they're improving in terms of saving money. But also ACOs represent probably one of the best possible ways of improving equity and expanding the definition of health to include social determinants. So I wonder, A, whether at some future time, not necessarily today, we can talk about our own certification program, but also build it into a broader discussion of the ACO program in Massachusetts and how it's working and whether it in fact is meeting the goals of expanding, as I said, the definition of health to include social determinants and expanding access in terms of equity.
That sounds great, Chair Altman, and we are working on the next iteration of our ACO certification program this fall. So that would be very timely to have a fulsome presentation that maybe talks about some of the updated national research, what we know about the Massachusetts experience, and then where we're thinking about taking our program. So that sounds like a great idea. Thank you. So with all of those updates behind us, let's turn now to the meat of today's meeting. And first, our standard, very quick agenda item on notices of material change. I believe I'm going to be turning this over to Kate Mills, our Director of Market Oversight, to provide this update. And then, Kate, I think we can move right into the drug pricing review process. So I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, I will seek to go quickly. So with our standard update in mind, since 2013, we wanted to let you know that we have now received notice of 112 provider transactions, with physician affiliations and formations of contracting entities continuing to be the most frequent, followed closely by hospital affiliations. On the next slide, you'll see that since our last board meeting, we elected not to proceed to a CMIR for 2 transactions. First, a proposal by South Shore Health System to form a new wholly owned contracting entity to be called the South Shore Health Integrated Delivery Network, or IDN, The IDN will replace the existing South Shore Physician Hospital Organization, or South Shore PHO. In our preliminary examination, we found limited scope for spending increases due to this transaction. South Shore anticipates that most, if not all, of those providers who participate in the current South Shore PHO will participate in the IDN. And we will also expect to receive a new MCN filing if a new provider group with more than $10 million in revenue wishes to join the IDN in the future. Second, we received notice of a proposed joint venture between Emerson Hospital and Physicians Endoscopy, a national outpatient endoscopy center development company, to develop a freestanding ASC to provide outpatient endoscopy services. The parties state that the proposed ASC reflects patient demand for access to outpatient services in a lower cost setting. And in our preliminary examination, we found limited scope for spending increases due to the transaction, and indeed some potential for reduced spending. Our analysis of all payer claims data indicates that facility fees at the freestanding ASC would likely be lower than the current facility fees for endoscopy services provided at Emerson Hospital. For both transactions, we did not review evidence indicating that the transactions would be likely to negatively impact quality or access to care. And if there are no questions on those, I will move ahead to our larger agenda item, an update on drug pricing review at the HPC. Great, so these first two slides may be familiar to you as we've used them in the past. They provide a brief overview of the new drug pricing authority at MassHealth and the HPC, signed into law as part of last year's budget. First, as you see summarized on this slide, MassHealth was given authority to negotiate directly with drug manufacturers for supplemental rebates, in addition to the standard rebates provided to all Medicaid programs across the country. If a manufacturer and MassHealth are unable to reach a supplemental rebate agreement, and the drug meets certain defined high-cost thresholds, specifically if the drug is projected to cost more than $25,000 per year per MassHealth utilizer post-rebates, or the aggregate annual cost to MassHealth for all utilizers is more than $10 million, that then triggers a process where MassHealth can propose a target value for the drug and solicit public input. If negotiations still fail at that point, MassHealth may then refer the manufacturer of the high-cost drug to the HPC for further review. The HPC process is then summarized on this slide. And you may recall we further detailed this process in the regulations that we issued earlier this year. Once the HPC receives a referral from MassHealth, it would request certain information from the manufacturer, including the manufacturer's own assessment of the value of their drug, as well as responses to HPC information requests, including those on a standard reporting form, which I'll describe in more detail in a few more slides. The HPC would then review that information from the manufacturer, as well as any other information provided by other stakeholders, such as patients and clinicians. And then the HPC must make its determination. The HPC can consult with MassHealth to help them propose a supplemental rebate for the drug, but we expect in most cases, our core responsibility, as you see highlighted here in orange, will be to assess the value of the drug and whether the pricing is unreasonable or excessive relative to its value. You can see on the right side of the slide here that there are some process points to bear in mind as part of the HPC's determination. Most importantly, at least 30 days prior to the HPC making any final determination that the pricing is unreasonable or excessive relative to its value, the HPC must determine that the pricing is potentially unreasonable or excessive and post a summary of its rationale. And then the manufacturer and other stakeholders would have an opportunity to respond on that before the HPC makes any final determination. Finally, the process is designed to be expedient, with the HPC being required to issue a final determination within 60 days of receipt of information from a manufacturer. And I will pause there if there are any questions on the general statutory requirements before I delve into where we are with the development of the process and framework. All right, well, hearing none, moving ahead to the next slide then. Over the last several months, we've worked on designing a process and framework for drug pricing reviews at the HPC with 4 core principles being kept in mind. So first, of course, we have aligned our work with the statute and regulations, including working off the statutory and regulatory factors for assessing value and pricing, and working off the processes laid out for engagement with the manufacturer as well as other stakeholders throughout the course of a drug pricing review. Second, we've sought to align our process and framework with evidence on how best to assess the value of pharmaceuticals, both based on value assessments here in the United States, as well as assessments in other countries, so that our assessments can really be based on an evidence-based approach. Third, we've worked to build our approach for drug pricing reviews off of processes that have been successful at the HPC for its market oversight efforts in the past, such as our process for evaluating provider market changes through the material change notice process and the cost and market impact review process, as well as our annual review process for evaluating provider and payer spending trends relative to the state's healthcare cost growth benchmark. And finally, in addition to working closely with our colleagues at Mass Health, we've sought to engage closely with stakeholders throughout the development of the drug pricing review process at the HPC, including drug manufacturers, as well as patient and consumer advocates, clinicians, payers, and experts in pharmaceutical pricing and policy. And we look forward to continuing that close engagement with stakeholders, both as we further refine our approach to these reviews generally, as well as we engage in specific drug reviews. This next slide really summarizes what we would expect to be the key inputs to and outputs from a drug pricing review at the HPC. On the input side, you see that our assessments would rely on a number of key pieces of information. So first, we will have information shared with us confidentially by Mass Health in connection with the referral, including information supporting their assessment of the target value. Second, as I mentioned, we will get several key pieces of information from manufacturers, including their own estimation of the value of the drug, responses to the standard reporting form, which I'll discuss further on the next few slides, and responses to any other HPC information requests. And manufacturers may also elect to provide other information to the HPC that they believe to be pertinent to our review. Next, we expect to receive information from other stakeholders, such as patients and patient groups, as well as clinicians. And we are currently working to develop a standardized approach to asking for and collecting that information. Then, of course, we will be relying heavily on other information that is available in the public domain, including assessments of value in academic literature, or conducted by health technology assessment bodies. And of course, we will be receiving support throughout from our expert consulting teams. And of course, we will be looking to you, our commissioners, to provide feedback and input throughout the process as well. On the output side of this chart, we expect that we will ultimately be releasing a determination of whether the pricing for a drug is unreasonable or excessive in relation to our assessment of its value. And as I noted before, there's a process step here where before we make a final determination, we would have to provide that opportunity for both manufacturers and other stakeholders to provide input on a determination that the pricing is potentially unreasonable or excessive. As you see in this next bullet, there are very specific protections laid out in statute and in our regulation to protect the confidentiality of information provided to us by manufacturers and Mass Health. And as you see in the final bullet on the right-hand side, we would publicly list any sources of information we rely on in making our final determination and carefully consider their methodologies and models, as well as any assumptions or limitations. And I'll pause there for any process questions before I dive into talking more about that standard reporting form.
Kate, this may be premature, but could you say a bit more about the concept of value in this process? Let's say, for example, that we were to apply this process to penicillin, which is it's a miracle drug, still is, but it's very cheap to produce, but its value is very, very high. I wouldn't think it would be wise to engage in a process which would cause the assessed price of penicillin to soar because it's so valuable. Similarly, if a drug were produced tomorrow that could cure COVID, its value would be infinite in terms of its benefit, but we would want to address pricing on quite a different foundation. Does the law tell us how to assess value at a level or help clarify that distinction?
That's a great question. So the next few slides will go through the factors that we would be looking at in a review. But ultimately, our charge is to assess the value of a drug and then determine whether or not pricing aligns with that value. And so we do recognize that there is going to be some part of this that is going to vary and be very fact specific given any drug under review. And so I expect that we would engage closely with our experts, as well as our experts who are actually commissioners on the board, to determine exactly how to make that assessment. Certainly, agree that those are scenarios where we would probably have to do a lot of discussion about how to align value and pricing in those circumstances.
Thanks, Kate. I look forward to the slides ahead.
Great. Any other questions before I move on to describing the standard reporting form? So this next slide and the next couple slides after it summarize the information relating to our standard reporting form, which the statute required us to develop, which all manufacturers would be required to complete. And this was finalized and released on our website on August 4th. So as you may recall, the HPC first released a draft of the standard reporting form along with the proposed regulation back last November for stakeholder input. And then we met extensively with stakeholders between that time and the time that we released the final form to our website, including industry groups, payers, PBMs, patient groups, as well as working closely, as I said, with our experts in pharmaceutical pricing and policy. And I'll note that while we do consider the form on our website to be final, it is a sub-regulatory document, which we can continue to update over time, again, in consultation with key stakeholders, including manufacturers. In general, we heard strong support for the information requests on the standard reporting form from patient groups, payers, PBMs, and clinical experts. And pharmaceutical manufacturers provided a range of feedback, which is summarized on the next slide, as well as a summary of how we then attempted to address that feedback. So the first key piece of feedback from manufacturers was a concern about confidentiality, particularly about requests to report confidential pricing and financial information. So in response, we completely updated the form to reinforce our statutory responsibilities to keep information confidential and to communicate how companies can securely transfer information to the HPC to ensure the confidentiality during transmission as well. Substantively, we also obscured confidential pricing information wherever possible. So we eliminated specific asks for prices net of rebates at a payer level for commercial prices, as well as internationally, and instead asked for averages net of rebates across commercial payers and across a specified list of countries. Second, industry groups asked that we be more flexible in how we require information to be reported. So we made several updates in accordance with that feedback. So we stated that manufacturers can, in consultation with HPC, provide substantially similar information to that which is requested in the form. And we would seek to work with manufacturers to ensure that they can provide information. For example, if they've had to provide similar information to other bodies in the past, we would work with them to see if we could just accept what they'd already put together. We also specifically updated requests to allow information to be reported in summary formats that we know are in use by other decision-making bodies. So the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy and the FDA clinical summaries, for example, we are now explicit that we would accept. And finally, we removed requirements to provide R&D, manufacturing and marketing expenditures in detailed categories, such as breaking out salaries and benefits, raw materials, direct expenses, et cetera. And instead, we're allowing manufacturers to be flexible in how they roll up those subcategories and simply tell us how they did it rather than doing it in a way that we're defining in advance. Third, industry groups commented that certain companies may not have access to certain information because, for example, they contract with third parties to distribute a drug or because they acquired a drug. So we updated the form to reflect that manufacturers may not have access to specific information on pricing for regional payers. And so, as I said, we updated the form to ask for nationwide averages rather than payer-specific pricing that may be negotiated by a third party. And as it relates to utilization, we asked for best estimates and existing analyses that they may have presented publicly. And finally, we heard concerns that some of our asks were a bit vague and that it could be difficult for manufacturers to determine what would constitute a complete response. So here we tried to update the form throughout to provide more specificity while also trying to capture information as precisely as possible. And so this was informed not only by the feedback from manufacturers, but also our consultations with clinical experts and experts in pharmaceutical pricing and policy. So for example, we updated requests to collect information by indication where applicable, by national drug code, which captures information on dosage, formulation, and package size, et cetera, to make sure that we were accurately capturing pricing and utilization in necessary categories. And then we specified in the form when manufacturers could provide to us existing information, for example, to clarify what to include in the manufacturer's submission on information to support drug pricing. So the final form is really just summarized on this slide. The categories of information should be broadly familiar because they were described and voted on as part of the regulation. So we really, in updating the form and in finalizing the regulation, we really closely considered the exact information that we will need in our assessments on the value and pricing of drugs, as well as how we'll ask for that information. So in the first section here on general drug information, we ask for general information about the drug, information related to the drug for each indication for which it's improved, et cetera. And in our second request on clinical efficacy, effectiveness, and outcomes, we ask for a summary of key clinical trials, additional evidence of clinical efficacy, effectiveness, and outcomes, and a complete list of all clinical studies relating to the drug. In the third group of requests on pricing information, we request information on current and historic wholesale acquisition cost at market introduction and over the past 5 years, net prices over the past 5 years, international coverage and pricing over the past 5 years, information to support the manufacturer's pricing of the drug, and a narrative for public release, which is prescribed by statute, describing any changes in price over the past 5 years. The fourth section requests the best estimate of utilization in Massachusetts and nationally, as well as projected utilization. And then the final section requests financial information, including budget and expenditures for research and development in the aggregate, as well as for the drug, for the full process of bringing the drug to market, information on the acquisition if a drug was acquired, manufacturing, production, and distribution budget and expenditures, and marketing budget and expenditures. And as I said, this final form is publicly available on our website now. And I'll pause there for any questions on that before I really turn to the framework and process for conducting these reviews.
Katie, are other states doing something similar? And if so, what are the differences?
That's a great question. So there are other states that are doing a similar process. And so in particular, New York has a drug utilization review board. And we actually spoke extensively with our colleagues at New York and in New York and modeled much of the development of the form after how they had asked for information. I will note that they asked for information on the financial side in particular in more detailed categories than we ended up asking for it, but much of our form was modeled after what they have been using.
Hey, what do we mean by international prices? Are you designating some countries and asking what the drug costs in those countries, or how will we get that information?
Yes, and so the way that the form is finally worded, it asks for a set list of countries. It asks for essentially the equivalent of the wholesale acquisition cost in those countries, which is less competitively sensitive than a price that is kind of post any rebates. And then we ask for an average across those countries, an average essentially rebate amount. And so that way we are getting the information we need to do assessments that would allow us to compare to international pricing while not getting the most confidential and sensitive country-specific pricing information.
We're not going to have country-specific price. We're not going to know what it costs in France or Germany or the UK.
No, we will know an average across those countries. So we will know the equivalent of the WAC price, the wholesale acquisition cost price in those countries. So it won't include any rebates in a country specific way. And then the rebate amounts will be averaged across those countries. And as I said, this was specifically done to try to protect confidentiality, given that that was one of the big areas of pushback from manufacturers. And this was a change made in close consultation with our experts who believed that this would still allow us to do comparative assessments.
I don't want to stay stuck on this, but if a country makes the price known, do we have another way to find it? I mean, it's not clear that to me that the in-country prices, the variation among countries is so proprietary, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, so I want to note that really, as you may recall from the inputs and outputs slide, we are obviously looking to get information from manufacturers, but we are also going to rely heavily on information available from other sources. And so certainly we'll do a comprehensive review of information that is already in the public domain on international pricing and coverage.
Thank you.
Kate, I remember from the public hearing that confidentiality was a major concern by the industry. And I know we have very tight controls in place relative to financial data from providers and payers. Did we need to make any other modifications about internal controls?
I will let Lois say more if she wants to, but at a high level, I will say that we did build the process off of the existing processes that we have developed for other reviews. And as you noted, we do have very strict confidentiality standards around our transactional reviews. And so we did seek to build off of that wherever possible. And I don't know, Lois, if you wanted to add anything more about our confidentiality protections.
Yeah, nothing specifically to add, but we did develop a specific process for this review and incorporated in the form instructions for manufacturers should reach out to us about secure methods of transmission, and we would work with them to make sure that however it's transferred to us, we would maintain the strictest confidentiality. We did share that our internal processes with manufacturers as well.
Tim, I saw your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick question on the utilization part 4 there. What information will be shared? How specific will it get? Is it just broadly utilization? Will be different segments of population? Like what information will we have on the utilization?
So as I said, we're going to get information from manufacturers broadly about utilization in Massachusetts and the US, but we will also have other sources of information. For example, we will be getting information from our colleagues at Mass Health. And so, insofar as a lot of this is driven by a referral from Mass Health, we would expect to have access to certain information from them on utilization as well.
Okay, now obviously utilization is something that can vary by population.
Yep.
And as you pointed out, we're going to be getting this referral from Mass Health, and also going back to David's discussion about equity and dealing with minority populations. we've seen in the past where certain drugs disproportionately affect illnesses that affect mass health and/or minorities. So the utilization information we're going to get, I'm sure, is going to be broken down by who is the likely utilizer of this drug.
Absolutely.
That's what I was asking. Thank you for that, Stuart.
Yes, apologies if I didn't quite answer it precisely enough from the get-go. So just to be very specific about what the form asks for, the form asks for utilization information for the past 5 years, nationally and in Massachusetts, in the categories of commercial payers, Medicare, Medicaid, and all payers. And so we do expect that breakdown to be reported from manufacturers, as well as some projected utilization for those populations as well. We could potentially get more granularity than that from Mass Health and the information that they would pass along to us.
Let me suggest that we do that. Going back to Colleen's description of how we're going to deal with inclusiveness, equity, and so on, we probably should use this study to focus on utilization by types of individuals when it has a specific or a differential impact on different groups. So why don't you go back and look to what extent we can expand that.
Absolutely. And I think actually that's probably the perfect segue to the next few slides where we really talk about the factors underlying our review, which we really would seek to identify in particular if there were particular populations that were affected. And so this slide is really about the data collection effort. And then you'll see in the factors, we really talk about how we would look at doing those assessments and do plan to have a particular focus on the affected populations.
I think David Cutler has a comment or a question.
Oh,
yeah,
great,
I was
yes.
just, oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to pick up on a theme that a couple of folks have raised, which is this is an area where there are many landmines buried. And so we need to be careful where we step because otherwise we will walk on them. So just a couple of things to be aware of. One is the issue of age and drugs that are taken more by older people. Are they worth less because there are fewer years that older people will live even in good health than younger people? And second is impairment status, sort of disability status, where advocates for people who are impaired have said you can't count quality adjusted life years because there are fewer quality adjusted life years at any given age for someone who's impaired than for someone who's not. So the literature has many, many debates about this, and it's something that, without going into detail now, it's something that we as a commission will have to be aware of.
Absolutely. And that is definitely something that we have been keenly aware of as we have sought to craft this process.
David, I would also add, going back to Don Berwick's question about value, there are some value models out there that are quite controversial because, as you pointed out, Don, if you get a drug that has the potential to impact on a large number of people in a very positive way, you get countervailing pressures. On the one hand, it's very valuable to the society, so value goes up. On the other hand, to the extent that it's going to be used by large numbers, if you price it high, the expenditures are huge. And therefore, you get into the extent to which a huge expenditure for one drug, what impact it has on our capacity to fund it. So this issue that you raised, Don, is a very important one. And again, as David Cutler said, the literature has been focusing on that. And I don't know if we've come up with any clear answer. This issue of value is a very tricky one. But we have and Kate, you may want to comment on this. Is our issue about value for society, for a subpopulation, or is it value to mass health? They're not necessarily the same.
All of the above, and that's actually the perfect segue.
All right, I'm glad I did that for you.
To this next slide. I know that was your goal. This next slide lists out the factors in our regulation. We've slightly reordered them, but these are really the factors for assessing value and pricing laid out in the regulation. And you'll see that we really kind of think of these as encompassing three primary domains. So on the left side, you see that the top part of this pill bottle is the net benefits. And here we want to be clear that we are interested in assessing both kind of clinical benefits to individuals, as well as benefits to the broader society, benefits to families, benefits to caregivers. So the answer to your question, Stuart, is both, or all of the above rather. We also obviously would expect that a major part of our review would be encompassing the domain of pricing and cost. And then the last section that you see of this pill bottle is other considerations. And so, for example, there may be considerations if to go back to Don Berwick's point, if we are looking at a drug that treats COVID, there are going to be special considerations in connection with that may not fit neatly within the other buckets. So this is broadly how we are conceptualizing the kind of framework for our review, being across these three domains: the net benefits, the pricing and the cost, and then the other considerations. And the next few slides really go through how the core questions we would expect to answer in each of these domains as part of a review.
Well, let me let you finish, Kate. Now I'm going to come back to this question. Sorry.
Oh, sure. The net benefit of the drugs, as I said, we see in kind of two core domains: the net clinical benefits, so the clinical efficacy and effectiveness, an improved treatment regimen that reduces complexity for the patient, a treatment that reduces the need for other medical care or non-medical care, as well as net societal benefits, so a drug that addresses unmet medical need in which there may be few other treatment options, or which treats a patient population with that is particularly vulnerable, or which has an extremely rare or severe condition, pricing and cost considerations, et cetera. And so this slide gives some examples of the questions we would ask to assess net benefits. So first, we would look at the evidence base evaluating the drug compared to alternatives on clinical outcomes. So for example, differences in morbidity or mortality or quality of life, including any differences for subpopulations, as well as the evidence base evaluating the drug compared to alternatives with regard to any negative impacts or safety impacts, so side effects, contraindications, the potential for misuse or abuse, which is specifically called out in our statute, including any differences for subpopulations. And then we would try to understand the benefits of the drug to society. So as I said, if the drug meets an unmet need, treats a rare or severe disease, treats patients that have been historically disadvantaged or underserved. And across all of these domains, I want to just emphasize the blue box on the bottom of the slide, that the HPC has committed to fully assess the quality of the evidence that we'd be looking at for each of these, the models and methodologies underlying those analyses, and any assumptions or limitations. And so really highlighting that some of these are some topics where, some of the models for assessing the quality of life, for example, have a fair bit of controversy around them, and we would plan to include that as part of our reviews. And the next slide here really goes into the core questions we would anticipate asking with regard to pricing and cost. So we would look for the comparative costs of the drug relative to alternative treatments. So including the costs of care that could be avoided if treatment is successful, as well as treatment that would be accrued in connection with a use of a drug. We would look at any formal economic analyses that exist to understand if a price is within value-based pricing ranges presented both in the US and internationally. We expect to compare the price of the drug among payers in the US and internationally, including the price at Mass Health relative to other Medicaid programs, other federal payers such as the VA and Medicare, and international payers. We would obviously look closely at what the manufacturer submits to us as the value of the drug, as well as their rationale for their pricing and any price increases. And finally, we would seek to understand the costs of the company. So the statute specifically directs us to collect information about research and development costs. So we will be collecting that information, research and development related to the drug itself and in the aggregate for the company, as well as any important costs related to, say, manufacturing and distribution of a drug. And then, yes.
Kate, can I lob in a question here? And this is in the same spirit as Don's and David's and Stuart's point with regard to value. One concern is with regard to the top bullet here on alternative treatments. This is such a lively area of research and development for companies. And I would expect that we're going to look, if asked, we're going to be looking at some of the new biological agents that the injectable drugs that, I want to say 15 years ago was maybe 10% of total pharmacy spend, and now it's pushing 50% of pharmacy spend. So these drugs that cost, $4,000, $5,000, $10,000 or more per patient per year. I understand for us, it's the threshold is 25, but there's just a lot more of these coming down the road. And one concern is that we, as regulators, we're looking at drugs, I think, that are, have come out and been approved in the last, let's say, the last couple of years. And how do we avoid, spending a lot of time and resources on, I'm looking at a drug that is under consideration now when it is about to be leapfrogged by yet another drug in the same class of treatment for diseases. And obviously, it is, as others have pointed out, it is pretty complicated to say, well, if the studies show that it's 5% better, what's that worth? When to an individual patient, as opposed to aggregate patients, that could, be the difference between a high quality or no quality of life. So just to go back, if drugs come in front of us for review, will we have the support from staff and consultants to understand that it is not, where the hockey puck is right now, but that it represents really where the hockey puck is going?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of very specific, fact-specific circumstances we want to make sure that we consider in individual drug reviews. And you are absolutely right. It could be a circumstance where we have a drug referred to us where we need to be looking at, other treatments that are in the pipeline as well. And so that's a great thing to, maybe add to this list where applicable. our goal would be, and I think that our consultants would echo this, that we would include that type of information in an assessment where it's applicable. But there will be some fact-specific inquiries with regard to any of these drug pricing reviews. So what you see summarized on these slides are the core questions that we would anticipate likely trying to answer in all cases. But you flagged a great one that might be a particularly important one in certain cases.
Just to try to put it into a shorter sentence, it's hard as regulators to look at a static question in such a dynamic area of therapeutics.
Absolutely. And we would try, along with our expert consulting teams, to take into account the upcoming changes in the market to the extent that we can ascertain those.
Yeah, I mean, I would want to all of us to look at drugs that have been approved in the past and their costs, the current drug that is under review, and drugs that have been approved since the drug that's under review was approved.
Right.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I do want to emphasize, obviously, we are both collecting information from manufacturers. So their assessment of value and their assessment of their pricing, their rationale for their pricing, as well as giving them the opportunity to respond to our initial findings. And so this is also an area where, I would expect that manufacturers, if, for example, they wanted to justify high pricing because they think they won't have kind of market share for long, we would expect them to relay that to us, and that could obviously help inform our determination as well. So this next slide, this final slide, is really just a catch-all, where it's important to just recognize that each therapeutic area is unique. And so there may very well be other considerations that we can't anticipate. So we did see a separate group of considerations that we wanted to include here that would allow us to flexibly include in our analyses anything else that could arise that's very fact specific in a drug pricing review. So if there were any special considerations relating to the drug or the affected population or the treatment with the drug that wasn't otherwise included in the framework. And so this final slide really just is a description of how we might put together all of these different pieces into a final assessment. So here we see two typologies that are examples of where we might make a determination that the pricing of a drug is reasonable, and where we might be more likely to make a determination that the pricing of a drug is unreasonable in relation to its value. So on the left side, we see that we would be more likely to make a judgment that the pricing of a drug is reasonable if, for example, there's strong evidence that the drug offers substantial benefits and few harms relative to alternatives, where the drug addresses an unmet need for a severe condition or addresses the needs of underserved populations, and where the pricing is comparable to comparator drugs and in line with pricing ranges suggested by formal economic analyses. And on the right side, you see the other typology. So where we might be more likely to make a judgment that the pricing of a drug is unreasonable. So for example, if there are relatively few benefits to the drug in comparison to alternatives, or where the evidence is pretty thin of any significant improvement relative to alternatives, where the pricing is comparatively high in relation to other payers and in comparison to pricing ranges suggested by formal economic analyses, and where the manufacturer might provide little rationale for pricing or price increases. And so these are just two examples kind of showing how we would really try to look across all of these different factors in ultimately making a fact-specific reasonableness determination as part of our responsibilities. And with that, I will pause again for any further questions.
I don't want to put Undersecretary Peters on the spot, but do we know where Mass Health is in their process of negotiating?
Yeah, so negotiations are sort of actively underway with a number of different manufacturers. So we have been working sort of in lockstep with our colleagues at the HPC so that the processes are being sort of developed in tandem. So I would say that negotiations are ongoing. Some have been successful in terms of obtaining a significant rebate, and others I think are still underway. So more to come.
If I could ask a question, please. I'm a little bit inhibited by not totally understanding what is statutorily required in this process and what we have discretion to do, Kate. So excuse my naivete on that. But as David said, this is a very complex terrain, and I would see this as having at least two parts. Part one is what's the value, determining the value. And then part two is determining what relationship, if any, we would like to encourage between value and price. And it seems the second is much more complex, much more difficult, because it involves our theory of that. How should price relate to value? If that's in the statute, our hands are tied. But for example, should there be some sense in our decision making about fairness or fair profit, where a value could be very high, but the price would be based on value would be unfairly high because it would deny people access, and it just doesn't feel like the right level of profit for a company. And I wonder, Stuart, David Cutler, you probably know a lot of economic theory about relating price to value, which we should learn about. But Stuart, I guess for the HPC's work, we probably need to reserve some time downstream to talk about our theory of this. Like how
I was going to suggest that just that issue. For example, and that's why I raised the issue about a drug that has a wide impact and has very substantial budget. So if you price that high, you could sort of wipe out, for example, Mass Health's budget for the next couple of years. And therefore that issue, and particularly where it generates substantial profits on the other side. So I would suggest that at some future time, as this thing is playing out, we do reserve time for that discussion. You're absolutely right. I don't think we can answer it right now, but it is something we need to go into. Kate, you're about finished with this, right?
Yes, this was the last slide. So we are just in the discussion section.
Well, I know we have to move on. We have some other information. Obviously, this is something that will come up. Ron, you wanted to ask a question before we bring this to a close.
Yeah, I think reasonable profit is a key point to consider. The question is, how do you define that? And then secondly, regardless of the value, I think we need to look at it in terms of reasonableness, and we do need to define that, because I think that becomes an important variable in this entire process.
Again, you're absolutely right. And it is that issue that we need to bring up as we discuss this more fully.
Well, thank you, commissioners, and for all your questions and comments. This was not intended by any means to be the final word on this conversation. As all of you have mentioned, this is very complex and new ground for HPC and generally for states. And so we are really trying to build our network and learn as much as possible, and wanted to have this opportunity today to give you an update on kind of the arc of where we're thinking. But as many of you mentioned, would really appreciate more time and opportunity for more discussion about how we may consider value, how we may, Ron, as you just said, really define and think about reasonableness, because that is a charge in our statute. So we will make that commitment to find additional, I suspect it will be not just in one other meeting, but an ongoing series of conversations as we continue this work. So Kate, I don't know if you have any final words.
No, that just sounds wonderful. We definitely look forward to a lot of continuing conversation on all of these points with our commissioners as well as other stakeholders.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other stakeholders are key here too. And so we want to continue those great relationships. So Chair Altman, I'm going to use my executive director prerogative, recognizing the time and recognizing that we do have a special guest with us today from the Division of Insurance to skip over the next agenda item and focus the rest of our time today on the COVID-19 impacts on the healthcare system, and then turn to a conversation with Kevin Began. So Kevin, you're not quite up right yet. First, we want to give a few slide updates from David Auerbach. But if that sounds all right to you, Stuart, we'll move to that agenda item.
That would be fine. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay,
So,
great.
yes.
All right, so we're going to move to turn over to David Auerbach, who, as he and his great team have done over the course of the last 6 months, really have updated data slides for us. Most of this is national data, sometimes with a regional cut, on what we know about spending impacts and other impacts of COVID on the healthcare system. So David, I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll start with the presentation from Kevin.
Thank you, David. And I think this part will be pretty brief. We're just showing 4 slides here, similar to ones that I have shown in the past. These first 2 are from a publication of the Commonwealth Fund and a number of other folks, including David Cutler. And these are showing trends in visits, as we've shown before, now through the end of July. And here it's broken down, and these are office visits and hospital outpatient visits, and it's broken down by areas of the country. The Northeast is the teal blue. And you see it, as we've seen before, the depth of the pandemic in April, visits were about 60, 70% down. And now they've kind of plateaued in the Northeast at a level of around 11, 12% below what the baseline was before the pandemic. And you can see we are generally lower than other parts of the country, although Arizona, Florida, Texas, which had big surges in cases at that time, they did dip even below where we were. And something interesting, let's go to the next slide, that you see when you break these visits into the type of visit is there are very different patterns of the recovery. Dermatology on the top, as we continue to show, has recovered fairly well, even above the baseline level. Adult primary care is approaching the baseline, that's the orange, but behavioral health and pediatric visits are still pretty far below their baseline levels. We've shown this before about the pediatrics. People are thinking about why that would be, but they're about 1/3 down, or 25, 30% down still. And behavioral health, which didn't drop as much because mainly because telehealth is fairly readily done in that category. But they are still 15% below baseline at this point, which is important to know. We've been tracking use of telehealth, especially over this time, and these slides, again updated through the end of July from IQVIA, show that the telehealth trend in the slide on the left, you can see those blue bars. Compared to the peak in around April, the volume of telehealth visits is about 1/3 or 1/2 as low as they were at the peak. But they seem to be stabilizing at that, at this level now, accounting for around 10% of all visits, which is what the graph on the right is showing, our telehealth. And in the last slide, we're showing the trends in healthcare employment. The main graph is the national picture, where you can see overall healthcare by the end of July is about 4% down still from February 2020. And there's difference across the different sectors. Hospitals have been generally less affected in terms of loss of employment, and the more outpatient sectors were more affected at first, but are increasing. And there are some interesting contrasts between Massachusetts and the rest of the country, as you see in that table below, where, as we've seen before, employment in physician offices is down more in Massachusetts, in nursing home and home health, much more, 15% off of the peak. Outpatient care is down more in Massachusetts, but as we showed before, in hospitals, hospital employment in Massachusetts is down less, only 1% decrease from the baseline. Okay, so that's the overall picture. Yeah.
Is that a quick question on have you seen any numbers that separate out the impact of employment in nursing homes versus home care versus pulling them together in one category?
I believe that we grouped those ourselves, and we would be able to have that. Yes, Hannah's confirming that with me. Thank you. So we can get you that separately right after. That would be important to know.
Thanks.
Any other questions on the updated data slides from David?
Can I just ask how you define home health services, or how this survey looks at home health? Is it all inclusive of agency and non-agency?
That's something I could probably check. This is the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it's all employment in that sector. And these are surveys of employers. And so however they decide on that category when they survey employers, I imagine it's pretty broad. Okay, good. Hannah's confirming, yes, agency and non-agency. We are pretty sure.
Right.
We'll confirm that too.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Cutler?
No, I was just going to echo that and just talk a little about how they form the data, but David said that.
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you, David Auerbach, for that update. And we will continue to update a compendium that we have on our website of these COVID data slides. So now I'm really pleased to be able to turn the agenda over to our longtime colleague and friend from the Division of Insurance, Kevin Began, who is a deputy commissioner and has presented, I think, many times before the HPC board over the last 8 years, and was so gracious to be able to come here today and present on some of the payer trends and the health insurance market trends that the Division of Insurance has been really watching closely. And so thank you, Kevin. I know you have some great slides and data to present to us. Commissioners, feel free to ask Kevin questions. And Kevin, you can feel free to defer if you need to. But I do want this to be a conversation because our commissioners have been really interested in understanding some of the dynamics in the health plan market. So thank you again, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me today. I do appreciate being in front of the commission. It is something the payers have probably had just as big a roller coaster over the last few months as the providers. It's a time of great uncertainty, and we at the Division of Insurance try to manage to have a little more certainty in markets. You all, I think, are probably aware the Division of Insurance's main roles are to license and monitor the financial solvencies of companies in the market, to oversee consumer protections, and also to foster healthy insurance markets. My role as the Deputy Commissioner for the health market is to oversee the accessibility and affordability of the health products that are offered in the insured market. Today, what I'd like to talk about are membership trends, utilization trends, rebates that are occurring within the market, and our most recent premium rate review process, which was one of the most difficult and contentious ones that I've had in a while. If I could have the next slides, I can actually skip one more. Thank you. We need to keep track of membership trends in our market so we can understand whether there are any major shifts that are occurring that impact the availability of coverage. We consistently have collected reports on a regular basis that try to keep track of trends in HMO membership, preferred provider plan membership, and membership in Medicare and individual markets. We did have grave concern with COVID-19 that there were going to be sudden and dramatic changes in membership in the market. We called a special exam to get quickly, reported monthly membership sent to us at the Division of Insurance on the 15th of each month. Because we collected on a special examination process, the information is only available in aggregate form as opposed to a company by company. But it does show us that things are not as difficult as we thought and expected they would be. The next slide. We've been collecting information roughly since March with more detail beginning in April, and we have seen very little difference in membership where we expected major changes in membership. Early in the process, we've had many communications with the carriers about how they need to be more flexible with accounts, especially to maintain membership and find ways to extend grace periods, allow for installment payments, and try to do everything they can to keep coverage going forward. Because of that, we think that there has been much less disruption in membership than we had worried about. Over the past 4 months between April and July, the overall number of covered lives in Massachusetts is only 10,510 lower than it was in April. There's 40,000 who are fewer covered under commercial accounts, but there are 30,000 more who have been covered under governmental accounts. So you'll see that Medicare and Medicaid membership have gone up. Again, this was counterintuitive for us, that 4 months after we imposed some of our rules, that we continue to see membership stay at as high levels. All our conversations with the connector have highlighted that they have seen some members increase within connector accounts, but we continue to see that membership in the small group, the large group, the ASO self-funded accounts continue to remain high. Some of the attrition that has occurred, we understand, is less to do with individuals that are on furlough losing coverage as much as has to do with some accounts, large accounts, actually just dropping all health coverage because they may no longer be in business. This is something that we monitor very carefully. We are getting the August ending numbers today. We will have them available within the next 2 to 3 days. It's necessary for us to have this information quickly. If indeed we see any cliff approach that happens, we need to make sure that policymakers are very aware of the changes in case there need to be other public policy solutions to look for ways to gain additional membership within other types of markets. On the next slide. We did this to get timely information. I highlight this for anyone who may likewise be aware that the Center for Health Information and Analysis is collecting their own series of reports. We are not intending to duplicate the information that CHIA does collect. There are some reasons that the information collected by the Division of Insurance will differ from CHIA. We report a month ahead. We report membership based on coverage that's issued in Massachusetts. CHIA does report membership based upon who lives in Massachusetts. Some of the other items are also just a way of keeping track. The most important thing is that both CHIA and DOI are most interested in examining membership trends. And we find that our reports are consistent regarding changes in membership trends over the past few months of the coronavirus. I stress this because this is important for us to follow. As we get information at the Division of Insurance, we make it public within a week of our collecting it. And obviously, if there are any major drop-offs, we want all the parties who are following membership in the market to be aware of them. So again, that's membership. Please.
Can I, yeah, this is Stuart. Can you go back to that previous slide? Because those numbers are, what I do see interesting is that in the large group market, where people were talking about the doom and gloom and the end of private insurance, you're talking about a little over 2% decline, primarily picked up by the increase in Medicaid. So just for what it's worth, we have not seen, as you pointed out, an ending of the employer-based insurance market, which some people have been suggesting. And two, that our safety net has been working. Whether it'll continue, of course, that's why you want to monitor it. But these numbers, I have not seen them before. They're very interesting.
We are very aware things can change quickly, and it is the reason we want to get them monthly. It is possible that some of the easing of grace periods and the easing of keeping people covered while they're furloughed will stop. And for that reason, no one thinks that this can continue forever.
Well, that's why it's worth following. Thank you.
Nope. Arguably, we need to stay on top of it, and we do have this information available on our website, and I'll make sure that I do make it available to the HPC going forward so they can pass it along to all the commissioners.
Thank you.
Kevin, do you have any information on temporary coverage gaps as people migrate from commercial to governmental accounts? Is it pretty seamless, or are there periods when they drop off?
Our understanding is that it's pretty seamless. We are collecting it monthly, and most of the employer coverage extends to the end of the month. We're seeing that people are enrolling pretty quickly into the connector coverage. If there are gaps, they may be weeks. They definitely are not months. But again,
Rick.
this is the day. I think we're all worried about what happens in the fall.
Rick, I know you have a question.
Yeah, Kevin, it's Rick Lord. So this is really interesting data, and thanks for sharing it. And it's a little surprising, and I'm just thinking about the unemployment rate in Massachusetts. We went from like 3% unemployment to 16, right, in a relatively short period of time. So you would have thought that you would have seen the greater drop off of employer-sponsored insurance. So maybe it is employers extending healthcare coverage for a period of time, but that could change, as you just said, in the coming months. So I guess I don't know if you want to comment on that, or I guess we need to continue to look at this over the next few months and see if it changes.
Well, we know we were very direct with all the carriers that they needed to take every effort imaginable in March and April to work with all the employers to find ways to continue coverage. Some of our colleagues in other states decided to use 1 month or 2 month moratoriums on terminating any employer's coverage. We went a different route instead to highlight that this was a partnership between the carriers and the employers. And it needed to be one where the carriers needed to work very closely with the employers. For better or worse, it's continued longer than I think we even hoped. And we continue to hope that it continues as long as necessary, but we continue to worry about the economy and how long this can continue. So we are hopeful that this will continue as long as needed, but we know there's a lot of small employers that are struggling, and it's necessary to have the safety nets of Medicare, Medicaid, and even the connector coverage for people to jump into. So again, I agree with you. We're surprised that it did not go down, but we continue to keep our fingers crossed that it will not go down in the future.
Thank you.
So that is membership. Regarding utilization, we do not have good information on utilization. Collecting it from the carriers, we do not get it as timely. It's not readily available. It can take 4 to 5 months of claims run out to get reliable data, and we have relied on collecting informal information from the carriers under our special examination statute. I think that the information that David Auerbach presented before has a good deal of detailed information. What we're trying to look at is not only what has happened, but also what is predicted to happen over the next few months. We do look at some of this information within a skeptical eye, but it's at least the information we have at this point from the carriers about the predictions for the rest of the year. So the next slide. We do know that March payments, as David has pointed out, were lower than February payments. There was a stockpiling of prescriptions, big increase in telehealth, and April payments went down by 35 to 50% for normal hospital ER medical office payments, even though there might have been a small offset for telehealth. And for COVID-19 treatment costs, the carriers definitely had much lower payments for April and May. During June and July, the carriers have been reporting that payments are getting closer to normal payment levels. The combination of telehealth and normal utilization is bringing things back to normal levels. And there has been increased testing for close contacts and hospital admission procedures. Different carriers have pointed out August and September are ones where they might be expecting higher than normal payment levels, with catch-up demand, postponed surgeries, providers more available on weekends and other days to catch up with demand, increased severity costs for those postponing care. And then for October and later, then they're also predicting that 10% higher than normal levels. Providers pushing for higher unit costs in order to account for new COVID-19 prevention. And then the costs they're preparing for new vaccines, with testing also adding to costs and higher intensity of services due to delayed costs. Again, most of this information is information we don't have facts to support, but we highlight the carriers have talked about the fact they are today seeing their utilization getting closer in total to what they actually had expected for the months of August and September. It is something that we need to monitor consistently for the rest of the year to see how this is going, because it's necessary for us to follow how it's affecting their availability of resources. And also, as you'll see later, it's very important for us as we're even predicting premiums going forward. I would say we need to collect more detailed information from the carriers. It's what we've used to try to at least evaluate what could be the levels of utilization for the rest of the year. I'll pause for a minute because, again, I don't have the same level of detail as David Auerbach did have, but it is something we need to keep track of trends going forward, not only what has happened over the last few months. Okay, next slide. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Kevin, why don't you go through this last part and then we'll take questions on the utilization section. Sorry, David.
So the last part that we need to monitor on our side is really the carriers' concerns about fall surges and how fall surges can dramatically impact how they need to pay for additional utilization now and in 2021. The carriers have pointed out to us that they've made over $50 million in cash advances to healthcare providers. Obviously, that was done during the heat of the April-May timeframe, and in some cases, it allowed for providers to have resources available to continue. They have pointed out to us that they have had losses in government programs, and many of them have pointed out that they are not getting the levels of reimbursement from certain of the government programs that are putting pressures on their bottom lines. And they also are stating that they're expecting to be a greater growth in future capitation arrangements with providers, as providers who did have capitation arrangements did have steady payments. And it's something they're expecting that providers will be more willing to accept capitation arrangements going forward. And lastly, a few carriers pointed out their extreme concerns during April and May, with significant reductions in their investment portfolios. We continue to monitor that because even though the market has come back, they and we continue to have concerns about whether or not the market may fall again and how that can impact overall finances for the companies in the market. So, David?
Professor Cutler.
Thank you, Kevin. Can you just go back one slide?
Yes.
Thank you. So if I sort of add up across all the months based on what's actuals as opposed to their speculation or forecast, it seems like if I took from March, April, May, June, July, just that, it looks like it's about 10% below. Oh, on a year over year basis, if everything else were the same, that would be about a 10% reduction for the year. Is that right?
I mean, it's probably 10 to 15% if you only look up to August, September.
Okay.
The carriers have highlighted in their opinion that during September, October, November, December, the increased utilization will still keep them below last year, but at the same time will actually be higher than the 10 to 15. They're predicting that it'll be probably 5% lower than last year.
So, but if I take so far the 10 to 15, they gave a little bit of it back they gave a little bit to the providers. They're using some of it to absorb lower payment from public programs. I'm not quite sure why, but let's leave that there. How much net are they below if I take that? Like, how much have they made if I take that?
I don't have that number, and I appreciate your asking that. We have not gotten their final financial statements for us to review to actually account for all of the numbers. They have made money in the second quarter. So for that reason, when you take into account the lower utilization and also some of the offsets that they made in payments out, there's no doubt that second quarter 2020 is going to be a very good quarter for them. We need to evaluate all 4 quarters to actually identify what their final results are. The only other thing that's not reflected here, but it'll be in my next series of slides, has to do with refunds and rebates. 2 of the companies, Harvard Pilgrim and also Blue Cross, did give refunds back to consumers. And there is going to be a lot of rebates that we're expecting that will be going back to consumers when we go through our MLR rebate process for 2020. So I think it's well known that this is something we need to look at more than 1 quarter as we're evaluating where the carriers are. And I think that as the truing up does happen, it is probable that many of the companies in the market will have rebates they need to give back to consumers in the market. Follow up?
Can I just so that was very helpful. Can I just ask one question? When they make their predictions for 2021, how much is like sort of huge risk factoring into what their premium is? Like in the sense that if the state had some type of reinsurance for very big losses, would that materially reduce premiums? Or are they saying, no, it's not going to be really bad. We just are pretty sure it's going to be a little bit higher.
If I could delay that until after I go through my premium section, I think I'd like to answer it after that.
Okay.
So if we could go to the next series of slides, I want to make sure that all are aware of refunds and MLR rebates within our market. The next slide. There has been this year a number of carriers that have filed with the Division of Insurance to return earned premiums because of lower utilization. It's not only happened in the automobile and the dental lines, it's also happened inside the medical lines. And that's because for certain months, those members had lower than expected claims that were filed due to COVID-19. As we do get these requests to make refunds, we look to see that the refunds or discounts are issued on a non-discriminatory basis, that they're not picking and choosing which employers or individuals get them. And they're not intended to be inducements to future renewals. They're not only giving them to individuals that are signing up new or to get people to renew coverage with the plan. They have to be refunds of earned premiums. At this point, Harvard Pilgrim and Blue Cross have filed and they received approval to refund portions of their earned premiums for persons and groups covered in the spring of 2020 to account for COVID-19. Other companies have likewise contacted the Division of Insurance, and they may also make similar filings. This is something that's not the same as recent guidance coming from the federal government regarding future premium discounts. It is something that it's a refund given back to covered persons based upon the fact that they were covered in one case during the months of March and April, another in the months of April and May. There is no requirement that carriers do this. Both of these companies elected to do this, and we wanted to make sure we got these on file as quickly as we could. We understand that for both of these companies that either refund checks to people who are no longer covered by these companies or premium offset amounts are being processed during this month for both of these companies. Next slide. We also do have a process that is built into our rules to collect information from carriers and review their rebate calculations annually. Carriers are required to meet both federal and state medical loss ratio thresholds, meaning that they're paying out a certain amount in claim dollars out of every premium dollar. And they need to refund premiums if they fall below the thresholds. For the large groups in the market, those with 50 plus employees, the federal MLR threshold is 80%. And for the small group individual market, which we at the division regulate, the state MLR threshold is 88%. Carriers filed their MLR calculations in mid-August for calendar year 2019. So this is something that takes place 8 months after the end of the calendar year. And DOI is completing its review. We have one company outstanding. But at this point, we know that 5 carriers are expected to refund $44 million of 2019 premiums to small group individual members by the end of September. Carriers have also filed their MLR calculations with the federal government for large groups, but it's not clear what the federal refunds may be for large group accounts. So for small employers and for individuals, and also for large employers, they may be getting reductions in premium this month, both because a carrier has a 2019 rebate that they're paying back. If they're covered by Harvard or for Blue Cross, they may be getting a 2020 premium refund. And it's all being mixed together as individuals are trying to understand how all the premiums are put together. It is something we need to look at things on a calendar year basis, which is why the money that they're rebating for 2019 is something required to actually be trued up versus the experience for 2019. At this time next year, we will be going through a rebate process for calendar year 2020 so that the companies that did have the reduced utilization in the second quarter with perhaps even some very good returns, they will be expected to go through this rebate analysis, and we highly expect that they will have to make rebates in next year to account for the lower utilization they have this year. So it is a little confusing to consumers, but we need to make sure we keep account of things on a calendar year basis.
Kevin, a quick question. What's the
Please.
denominator for the group and individual sectors? I mean, is it 10 billion? Is it 8 billion? What's that 44 represent?
It's probably around the 8 billion number. So it is not substantial number on a total basis, but for those individuals and small employers that are getting the rebates, it's a good benefit for them. I would highly expect the numbers for 2020 to be much higher, much higher. I cannot yet predict what it is, and that's why we need to see what the rest of 2020 is like.
Thank you.
So my last series of slides have to do with what was one of the most difficult rate review processes that I needed to go through at the division because of all the uncertainty. On the next slide. I think you probably know we have a quarterly rate review process, so that as part of this, carriers need to make predictions for the upcoming time period for what their costs will be. They need to file a standard data sheet that includes detail about membership, claims history, administrative expenses, and trends that support their future projections and the calculation of rates. They're expected to provide significant details about all of their assumptions, including about risk adjustment and taxes. We do assign each carrier's filing to a consulting actuary who reviews all assumptions and sends inquiries to challenge all assumptions made in the filings. And after 30 days, they report all their findings to the DOI in the areas where we can question and debate the actuarial assumptions. We then have staff contact the carriers to point out the issues, and we seek the carriers' amendments to filings so that lower rates may be achieved outside of the adversarial hearing process. If we ultimately decide to disapprove rates, we must do it by the 45th day. They sent in their filings roughly around July 2nd. We needed to decide by roughly August 16th whether we were going to disapprove rates and then go through mandatory rate hearings. Next page. So we completed our review on August 14th for every company, but for Tufts Health public plans. During the review, we questioned all the carrier assumptions, pushed back where carriers were being conservative. We indicated to the carriers that conservatism did not help to actually build in any conservatism now so that people could not afford premiums just because they wanted to be conservative and give rebates in case they were wrong. We were able to negotiate many carriers to reducing the requested increases by 1% or more. However, there were still companies we weren't able to get to go down to a level we wanted. We considered disapproving rates filed at a level above 10% and going through a hearing, but elected not to take this route because it would disrupt the need to have rates available for the upcoming 2021 open enrollment process through the connector beginning in October. Carriers were made aware that their second quarter 2021 rates would go through a different process that could lead to a hearing. And reluctantly, we actually allowed final average rates for the first quarter that are 7.9% higher than those for the first quarter 2020. If you can go to the next page. You'll notice that the first quarter of 2021 impacts about 460,000 renewing members. You'll notice that many of these members are concentrated in the Tufts Health public plan and also the BMC, Boston Medical Center Health Plan products, which are offered as the Connector Care low-cost options. You'll notice that the range of rate changes did go dramatically over the map. Ignoring Connecticut, a small company on the Springfield border, it is something that the carriers in the market did have rates that were roughly around 4 to 8%. However, Tufts Health public plans did have a rate increase of 12.2% that we were definitely not happy with. There were many reasons why that company did need a rate increase. We just did not think it needed to be as high as 12.2%. For any and all of these, we need to make sure that the rates are on file and available as quickly as we can get them, but we need to make sure we push them back as much as they can. For every one of these companies, they highlighted the uncertainty associated with 2021. Looking at 2020 and not knowing what is going to happen exactly for the rest of the year, they need to predict what their utilization is between January and December of 2021. And in each case, the companies highlighted the uncertainty associated with vaccine costs, the uncertainty associated with more intensive care being needed because individuals were putting off care, and also the increase that is going on in certain types of utilization, including behavioral health. Last slide. So the key problem that we debated with each company was whether all utilization was returning to pre-COVID-19 levels. The carriers likewise pointed out a concern they have about unit costs going up, in that they are hearing from many care providers the need to negotiate higher unit costs to reflect the cost of more PPE and COVID preventive activities, as well as increased use of certain high-cost technology. They highlighted the cost they need to plan for new pharmaceuticals, but more importantly, for increased vaccines and testing. And they did highlight that there are new behavioral health care services that they need to build in, including new behavioral health for children and adolescent costs. Having said that, we know that each of these rates had to be evaluated on a company-by-company basis to make sure that each of them looked at the company's financial situation, the pressures they had from not only the insurance side, but also from other lines of business that affected their bottom line. I can say that each company is in a different place financially. A company that might have been able to provide refunds this year, such as Blue Cross and Harvard, actually was able to do it because their financial situation might have afforded it. Others were not in the same situation. But I'd say for the premiums, it's hard to predict the future. We know that you need to look at the expenses for that year. They cannot carry forward their benefits or their underutilization from 2020 to 2021. 2020 needs to be looked at individually, and all the rebates for 2020 are looking at the underutilization for 2020. But for 2021, our challenge was trying to predict the future based upon what we knew from the past. I'll stop there just in case you have questions.
Well, this was really, Gary, thank you so much. This was really interesting. I want to make sure if anybody has any final questions before I turn it back to David. Again, keep us informed, because the overlap between what you're talking about and our issues, particularly I'm interested in this issue about providers negotiating higher unit costs and what impact that will have on premiums and prices, which will affect us, overlaps very much with our mandate.
Appreciate
Stuart,
that.
I just had one quick question for Kevin. Will you?
Sure.
Will the DOI also consider or model the likely continuing remote engagement of patients, which is far less expensive to carry out? I mean, as a primary care doc, I have, and I think this is still the case, 4.5 full-time equivalent staff in the office. Remote engagement of patients is obviously far more convenient for both patients and physicians. And if there were a 10% utilization remote, would you put that into your calculation as it pertains to rate increases? Yeah. Thanks.
No, absolutely. I think that the key thing that we're all looking for telehealth is to predict the way it's going to roll out for 2021. I think that all know that the current situation is that all telehealth visits are paid at 100% of a doctor office visit, and there are no restrictions on the platforms that are being used, and also regarding much of the utilization that's being provided. I think that we all think there needs to be some constructs so that there is some agreement about how carriers contract with providers about using certain types of telehealth platforms. There will need to be some negotiation regarding how reimbursement is done. We have heard stories that there are claims that come in for a 2-minute telephone call that are being put in with a charge that's equal to a doctor office visit. I think there needs to be some agreement about where the lines of reimbursement are, depending upon what type of call does happen. Much of that is part of the uncertainty, and I think there is a bill that's going through the legislature that we're hopeful may allow for some steady state going forward. I think the carriers do appreciate and agree that it is the wave that we need to continue with in the future. It's just a matter of making sure that there can be some parameters and explanations about how to bill, how to pay for the billing, and also to delineate what types of care are most appropriate under telehealth. So it is something we think will continue and will be definitely helpful as long as it can be constrained and used appropriately for all parties.
Thank you again, Kevin. This was great. David, you want to take it back?
Sure. Thank you, Kevin, and lots to work with you and your team on, but do want to highlight the topic you just talked about in terms of telehealth and payment policies. And certainly we have been doing our own investigative work and examination in this area and see an opportunity for collaboration as we think about the future in this area, something that is contemplated by some of the legislation that's currently working through Beacon Hill. So look forward to lots of communications, but and work together. Thank you.
We'd welcome it too. Thanks for inviting us again.
The last slide here, I just want to highlight to the commissioners and to the public that we do have our policy committee meetings on September 30th. So we'll have a meeting of the Market Oversight and Transparency Committee, as well as the Care Delivery Transformation Committee. And we'll have a whole suite of agenda items to discuss with you at the end of the month. One of which we unfortunately had to skip over today, which was a presentation on research into end-of-life care. A really incredible work that we're so proud of and did not want to give short shrift here today at the end of our meeting time. So we're going to move that to the committee and be able to have that presentation and conversation at that time. So look forward to agendas for those meetings at the end of the month, as well as, again, a reminder, Tuesday, October 20th, our cost trends hearings focus on assessing impact and advancing equity. So mark your calendars for that as well, and much more information to come. Stuart, commissioners, thank you for a great meeting today. We have a lot of follow-up work to do and look forward to it. And thank you everyone for making these meetings just so engaging and interactive and being able to have these discussions. Really such a pleasure to see you all virtually and to continue this work. So Stuart, thank you.
Thank you. This was great. So I'll take a motion to adjourn unless there's some final questions or comments. So those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All right. Thank you, David, and we'll be back, and we look forward to discussing